The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Baumer, Executive Director of the Colorado Municipal League. Thank you for attending today's Legislative Update webinar. Those of you who are elected officials who have registered for this webinar will receive 1 university training credit. Today's presentation will be posted on our website, www.cml.org under training materials. This webinar is being recorded and will also be posted to our website. For those of you who aren't familiar with the webinar format, you should see a control panel to the top right of your screen. You have an orange arrow to the left of the panel, which will minimize the entire box. All participants will be muted for the webinar, but are encouraged to ask questions by typing them into the question box on the control panel. We will hold a Q&A near the end of the webinar, but please feel free to type in questions as you think of them throughout the presentation. With me today is the remainder of the CML advocacy team, Megan Dollar, Morgan Cullen, and Brandy DeLang. And with that, we will get started. For those of you who participated in the session, the webinar at the beginning of the session, you'll see some familiar topics. We thought we'd circle back around and see where we're at in April, and then obviously put a little bit more meat on the bones as to what has happened with some of those issues and some new ones that have come along that we maybe didn't totally expect. Just a quick little overview on our CML advocacy and where to find information at any time. And there's the team, our contact information. Just remember, you can always go to www.cml.org to the 2019 Legislative Session tab, which is on the top right under Legislative. That's where you find our current edition of our State House report, video, and also position papers, links to our box score of support and opposed bills on the right-hand side, as well as bills that we're following both in the House and the Senate, and any positions if we have any. So that's a resource all the time. Obviously, as we are in the last 26 days of the legislative session, things will be moving quickly. The State House report is updated weekly. So anything that happens faster than that, if you get our State House report by email, you will also get an action alert if action is needed. And if at any time you need to get a hold of us to find out what's going on, just email or call. We'll come back to that. So a number of issues affecting municipalities that we're going to touch on today: broadband, housing, employment, marijuana, municipal courts, oil and gas, public safety, sustainability, tax and finance, and transportation. If there's a subject area that you don't see on there, but you know there's legislation being considered, or you want to find out something more about something that's not there, just at any time type a question into the question box, and we'll catch those at the end. So our first issue that we'll be talking about, that'll be Brandy talking about broadband.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Okay, so we've got a couple of updates here. If you recall, back in January, we had a broadband easement bill introduced, Senate Bill 107, and as its original form, there were a lot of questions about that version of the bill. Specifically, there were some issues that the REAs and municipalities and counties and several stakeholders brought up with the bill sponsor. But the bill sponsor at the time kind of instructed everybody to view that introduced bill more as a working draft rather than the final product. We have since seen a strike below that has entirely cut out municipal utilities, which is a good thing. It took out a lot of the concerns that several of our folks had. But it also kind of remains to be seen if this bill, or excuse me, if the strike below will be the final version that we'll see in committee, or if it'll be updated even further to reflect other changes. Secondarily, if you recall, in the State of the State, the governor did address a potential 152 repeal. That has yet to really materialize. We also know that some of the some legislators within the House were interested in this concept as well, but we sat down and had a few conversations with them. And now it seems like perhaps there's some other focuses that may come into play either this session or next session. We'll keep you guys updated as those develop.
And just a little glossary check-in for those who may not know what a strike below is. That means strike everything below the enacting clause of the legislation, which basically means start all over from scratch. Housing, Megan.
Thank you. So there's a couple of pieces of legislation aimed at looking at permanent funding, state funding for affordable housing in Colorado, which is something that the state lacks at this point. One that CML is definitely supporting that has yet to be introduced will allow for certain funds from the unclaimed property tax fund, unclaimed property fund, to get moved over to the Division of Housing Grants and Loans line item. The bill also specifies that it can be used for abandoned housing rehabilitation, potential gap funding, things of that nature. So there's a lot of things that could be very good about that bill. We expect that CML will support it when it gets introduced. Another piece of legislation that's already been introduced, House Bill 19-1228. What this bill does is expands the existing affordable housing tax credit program, which is a state low-income housing tax credit that's administered by the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority. This is a significant program that's been in effect for about 5 years now. This bill will continue the program and also double potentially the amount of tax credits that it can administer from $5 million to $10 million. With the $5 million, the CHAFA has already been able to subsidize over 4,000 units around the state. So this is a program that's definitely been proven to impact the affordable housing community in a very positive way. The other piece that I'd like to talk about is rent stabilization. This is Senate Bill 225. It does a few things. It removes the prohibition on local governments enacting rent control ordinances, and then adds in enacting or enabling language that allows a local government to do an ordinance or agreement or even a building code discussion around something that could stabilize rents in their community. CML has it listed as a support position right now, but our interest in the bill is actually very narrow. We are looking to further clarify the Telluride decision that took a big chunk out of our land use authority when it came to affordable housing. And so while we support the bill, we aren't necessarily supportive of rent control as a policy, and would actually like to see some guardrails being put on the bill at this time. The bill will be heard in committee sometime this week, so we'll have to see whether or not it gets legs moving forward.
So employment issues have been at center stage throughout most of the legislative session, with equal pay and ban the box legislation related to employee background checks. But there's two that we are focusing on in this big ticket subject area. One is Senate Bill 188. This is the Family Medical Leave Insurance bill, which is similar or intended to be similar to the Federal Family Medical Leave Act, with the inclusion of a wage replacement. That's funded through a payroll deduction, which has been one of the significant issues of concern in the legislation, as well as currently even with some of the amendments that have been adopted and with others that have been proposed. The Family Medical Leave Insurance Bill, or Family Bill, as it's referred to, still has serious alignment issues with the Family Medical Leave Act. It would be very difficult for employers to implement, and coordination of benefits is a problem. This bill just has a lot of problems right now. It's bogged down in the Senate Finance Committee while amendment discussions are still ongoing. I would say there is a significant amount of concern by committee members from both sides of the aisle, as well as outside of the Senate Finance Committee in both chambers on both sides of the aisle. So I don't know if this can be salvaged yet or not. It depends how far the proponents are willing to move. Frankly, at this point, having not been willing to move that far, I would say that the prospects for the bill are dim, and if they aren't willing to make a bunch of changes, that's probably the best thing. But we'll see. That bill is scheduled for tomorrow in committee, and we'll see what kind of movement there is. On the other side of the coin, a CML support bill, House Bill 1210, and kind of similar to what Megan described with rent stabilization, we had a very narrow interest in supporting the legislation, and then maybe a secondary level of interest as it relates to employers in our communities. The bill comes about from a preemption that's in statute, as well as longstanding case law that preempts local governments from enacting a minimum wage that's different than the states. And of course, we have a constitutional amendment that sets the minimum now. It's currently $11.10 an hour. It'll be $12 on January 1st, and then adjusted for inflation afterwards. The legislation grants affirmative authority to municipalities and counties to exceed the minimum wage, and that was essentially the limited interests that the league had, was the local control element. The bill is introduced, and as it passed the House, it really has a lot more expansive authority for local governments, and I think even far more expansive than most municipalities and counties would have thought they needed. And we've been working with concerned employers, opponents of the bill, to try to put some appropriate guardrails on the bill. There were some in the House, for example, the ability for local governments to band together, have IGAs establishing that they would have the same minimum wage, whatever that is. And we know that when the bill is heard today, actually not too long after this webinar is done, the Committee at Senate Business, Labor, and Technology is going to take testimony on the bill. There's still a number of amendments being considered, but we do expect it to be constrained even more, potentially metering the rate at which a local minimum wage could increase year over year in the same manner that the state's constitutional amendment did. Possibly a cap, although that's not on the table yet, and then dealing with this tricky issue of workers traveling through multiple jurisdictions and how to alleviate problems with employers keeping track of that. So I would say this bill it's definitely going to pass this session, but still has a ways to go in determining the full scope of municipal and county authority. Marijuana is a perennial issue now. On-premise consumption. Our CML's policy committee and the league has said for a couple of years now that on-premise consumption is really not just a matter of if, but when. So we keep, when we see legislation introduced, try to ensure that if that's going to be the one that passes, that it has maximum amount of local control in it. House Bill 1230, which creates statutory authority for hospitality establishments, is this year's bill. There are two types of hospitality establishments, those that do not allow on-site sales and those that do. Variations of each type are allowed, for example, the ability to be mobile. Here's the big issue for the municipal local control is they aren't allowed unless municipalities allow them. They can be then further regulated or constrained, more stringent requirements or additional regulations. And the exemption from the Colorado Clean Indoor Air Act that's in the bill for marijuana smoke is also a local option. We were formerly opposed. We opposed the bill unless it was clarified that that was a local option. The amendment was added, and so now we're formally opposed. Delivery has come back again this year. This is something that the industry itself is not unanimous on. There are proponents and opponents of the bill within the industry. It is moving through the House right now, and with amendments that were adopted in committee and House Business, the league is also formally opposed. Essentially, delivery can only occur. Let me start it the other way. Delivery can't occur in any municipality that does not allow medical delivery sales or retail sales. No retail delivery can occur. If a municipality allows medical or retail, then they still have to further opt in to allow delivery and then can place constraints on that such that their businesses would not be able to deliver outside of their jurisdiction. Probably more importantly to the league's dropping our opposition is that a municipality can prevent deliveries from coming in from other jurisdictions. A couple other pieces to that as well, but with the amendment, CML dropped our opposition on the bill. And again, it's still in the House, but it is moving. Municipal courts.
Thank you. So as expected, a lot of bills focusing on criminal justice reform, although not as many focused on the municipal level as I had assumed for this year. But there was one piece of legislation that directly affected municipal courts, and that was House Bill 1225. What House Bill 1225 sought to do was it does seek to do is to remove monetary bail as an option for traffic offenses, petty offenses on the state level, and as well as municipal ordinance violations. As the bill was introduced, it was unclear which municipal ordinance violations were the bill applied to. So CML worked with the proponents and the sponsor to get clarifying language that if a municipal ordinance violation has a comparable state misdemeanor, that they are not contained within that legislation, and there's still an option for monetary bail and bond. That was an important clarification just to make sure that violent crimes were not contained within that piece of legislation. The idea was to get the lowest violations. Additionally, CML is still working with proponents.
Sorry.
No, you're good. We got to go back to.
Jeez.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No, you're good. CML is still hoping to initiate or get, along with other entities at the Capitol, the district attorneys, and judicial, to introduce a bill with 25 days left to clean up the current juvenile expungement statute. There are some pieces of that statute that municipal courts really need to get cleaned up right now that are causing some heartburn for us, particularly a lot of the notification pieces within the law. So we're still hoping to get that moved forward.
Okay. On to oil and gas. So as you guys are aware, Senate Bill 181 was introduced at the very beginning of March and made its way through the legislature throughout the entire month of March with 6 committee hearings and then extensive floor debates both in the Senate and in the House. And as you guys are probably aware, during that time, CML was very instrumental in getting very significant amendments added to the bill. So in particular, those amendments include clarifying that local governments they're able to regulate surface impacts of oil and gas only. So basically, this is our traditional no downhole authority that we like to talk about. We also were able to clarify that local governments have have authority within their own jurisdiction only. So this means that you can't go playing around in somebody else's toy box without their permission or without having some sort of conversation prior. And then finally, we also clarified that if a local government determines that they want to create more stringent regulations than the state, that is fine, and that is not something that would create issue. Originally, as written, it was kind of unclear as to whether or not we were able to do so. So these were amendments that CML either asked for and or strongly advocated for in our position during the month of March.
And I'll just add this because I appreciate all the contact that we've received from members throughout the state who expressed various concerns or opinions or support, just depended where it came from and what the issue was. One slide does not do this this legislation justice. We know this was a major piece of legislation for this session, and will continue to be something that we have to work on behalf of all of our members going forward. So the moving on to the next slide certainly does not signify that we are done with this issue by any stretch. And thanks again for all the contacts we received. Keep it up. Keep it up. Public safety.
All right, Senate Bill 8, as I'm sure you can tell from the bill number, this has been on the calendar for quite some time. This is part of this comes from the Substance Abuse Interim Committee. This bill specifically focuses on substance abuse in the criminal justice system. It creates a record sealing mechanism for certain low-level drug offenses. And for our purposes, increases funding for law enforcement to work with other local entities on harm reduction and diversion programs. This is a big issue for local governments in trying to look at other options other options to get individuals to treatment rather than getting them in the criminal justice system. And so CML is in support of this legislation. And then finally, on the recovery aspect of substance abuse, HB 1009, the big piece of that bill for local governments is that the bill creates guidelines for sober living homes that they must adhere to. And we are supportive of that part of the legislation. The legislation also expands the housing voucher program within the Department of Local Affairs. It's outstanding as to whether or not that piece will be funded or guaranteed to be funded, but that's something that CML is also supportive on as well.
Morgan is still here. Go ahead, Morgan.
Thank you, Kevin. One of the priorities that we had going into the 2019 legislative session was repealing Statute 2517-104. That is a state preemption on local prohibitions of plastic products, and it's an issue that has come up for more and more of our members as they are looking to reduce the amount of single-use plastic products in their communities. It's one that we pursued and are continuing to pursue. Our bill sponsor was also excited about pursuing the opportunity as well, but there's a lot of other high-profile legislation that they were working on over the course of the session. Kind of took a little bit longer than we had anticipated, and right now there's just not enough time left in the remainder of the session to pursue it this year. So the silver lining in all of this is that we'll be able to continue to do some interim committee and stakeholder work on the issue going forward, and we will pursue it in 2020. 100% renewable energy by 2040. This was a big priority for Governor Polis when he was campaigning over the past year for election, for his gubernatorial election. And we were curious to see how the state legislature was going to move forward on reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the state. That issue was ultimately culminated in two pieces of legislation: Senate Bill 96, which requires the Air Quality Control Commission to collect climate change data and then also provide long-term forecasting. And then another bill that was recently introduced, House Bill 1261, that just passed out of House Energy and Environment Committee on Friday. Actually sets specific benchmarks and authorizes the Colorado Air Quality Control Commission to promulgate rules in order to meet those benchmarks. Specifically, those are 26% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels by 2025, 50% by 2030, and 90% by 2050.
Tax and finance issues, first sales tax, we've talked about this a lot. There's really, for the 71 self-collecting home rule municipalities, not anything that's going to happen this session that directly affects you. That's not a bad thing. With all the attention and maybe not full understanding of what the Wayfair decision means for particularly the state of Colorado and how we have to move forward. There are some folks that thought we should have an instantaneous solution. We have a little bit more complicated system, and it's going to take a little bit more work, but we believe can be done in such a way that maintains constitutional home rule authority and the ability to maintain local rate and base for those 71. But for all the statutory entities, municipalities, counties, and special districts for whom the state collects and remits, House Bill 1240 is a vehicle that essentially codifies the state's rules from last fall that were so controversial that take effect on May 31st with a few enhancements, establishes a de minimis amount under which a retailer would not be required to collect and remit sales taxes, both in-state and from remote sellers outside of their own jurisdiction. So we had supported that. A small business that doesn't have a lot of sales to other jurisdictions, it's more of an administrative burden for them than for any tax benefit that would be realized. So we had supported that in other legislation. It's probably good that it's part of this. But in the short term, all of the taxing will be based on the point of sale and not the destination until Senate Bill 6's or something like it, single point of remittance system comes online. So there will be a lot of discussion, we believe, with the Interim Sales and Use Tax Simplification Committee that CML is part of, along with some of our municipal members, and we'll see how that goes forward. In the meantime, self-collecting home rule municipalities have been doing quite well with the remote sellers pursuing a policy of voluntary compliance where they're asking remote sellers to collect and remit, and by and large, they're doing it. On property tax, that has been, there's a lot of noise about that, obviously, with the continued decline of the residential assessment rate. The new estimated residential assessment rate was predicted to drop from 7.2 to 6.95%. We just heard from Governor Polis last week that they have, I call it a workaround. I guess I don't know what else to call it, but there is a legal means of which they believe they can hold the residential assessment rate where it's at, and more details on that will be provided. That probably seals the fate on whether or not any Gallagher questions, constitutional in nature, would be recommended for the fall ballot. Certainly, with 26 days left, it seems like the air is out of that balloon. But depending on what happens with the residential assessment rate once it's determined, which I believe is this week, then that will dictate a lot of what goes forward from there. So stay tuned. We know this is a huge issue for special districts and counties and schools that rely heavily on property tax, but municipalities have property tax too, so we're all in this one together.
And transportation funding, another big issue down at the legislature this year, not just for the state, but also for municipalities across the state that are just equally hit hard by the depreciating revenue of the gas tax. Couple of kind of the big picture issues with transportation funding this year was the one-time money that was allocated through Senate Bill 1, whether or not that money was going to be kept whole or if any changes were going to be made this session to that money. So far, there haven't been any changes, and that includes the $150 million appropriation to the HUTF with the local share back, and then the additional $50 million in one-time state money. There's one caveat to that. Right now, there haven't been any changes to the $2.34 billion bonding measure that is supposed to be referred to voters in 2019. However, that could change, and we may see that piece of it repealed. If that is the case, though, you will still see the lease purchase agreements out of Senate Bill 17-267, which was approximately $1.7 billion, continue to move forward. Then the other question was, well, are they going to add any additional money this year to help support transportation going forward? And it looked like coming out of the JBC that they were going to support an additional an amendment to the long bill for $34 million. A deal was struck in the Senate that increased that by $106 million, and then it was scaled back once the House took up Senate Bill 207 last week. So right now we're looking at an additional $100 million in general fund money, which will go to the operational account of the State Highway Fund. It won't go through the HUTF, so there won't be a local share back provision for that. And then also long-term funding. This short-term one-time money is great, but we need to figure out a long-term sustainable revenue source for transportation going forward. With the defeat of Propositions 109 and 110, a big unanswered question in the General Assembly is how are we going to figure that out, either under the dome or through a referred measure to voters. We haven't seen a whole lot. There was one bill, House Bill 1157, was introduced, and it was a bill we actually opposed, even though we generally support transportation funding, because of the revenue source. They use the specific ownership tax, which has always been a local source of municipal general fund revenue, and they wanted to use it to cover state transportation issues, which also had some constitutionality issues with it as well. So that bill was ultimately defeated. We have seen a bill that was just recently introduced that would be a referred measure that would actually repeal the gas tax and replace it with a statewide sales tax. That bill, SCR 2019-003. It was just introduced and hasn't been up in committee yet. We could see a couple of more before the session's out. So it doesn't look like they're going, there's a grand strategy to kind of deal with the transportation funding all in one fell swoop. It looks like they're taking more of a piecemeal, incremental approach to try and find some long-term funding solutions. But we'll keep you posted on that.
And to that end, and I didn't do a separate slide on it, but the league testified in support of House Bills 1257 and 1258. I think pretty much everyone on the line right now, and 85% of our members, have successfully debruced for local revenue streams. 1257 would place on the ballot a question for the fall ballot, would be Proposition CC, asking voters to debruce state revenue and apply it to K through 12 higher ed and transportation. 1258 is a companion that if the voters approve Prop CC, then would actually implement the split of any revenue above the Tabor cap. It won't be much. It does would apply to the first year and would send about $22 million potentially to transportation and distributed through HUTF. 10% of that, 10% of the state highway fund dollars would be available for transit. The rest is 18% of it goes to municipalities. It's not a lot of money. To Morgan's point, it's would be part of a piecemeal approach, but something's better than nothing. And in a sort of an unintended, or maybe it was intended, consequence, it also helps protect severance tax revenues, which when Tabor caps have been exceeded most recently, severance tax revenues were transferred to help backfill Tabor refunds from the general fund. So again, a lot of moving parts in transportation, and as to Morgan's point, a piecemeal approach. That is the end of our subject areas. So if you're thinking about something we didn't talk about, then please do start typing your questions in the question area. I just got a couple of slides on how we keep, one slide I think, on how we keep you informed. You're probably aware of it. Obviously, the State House report gets delivered to your inbox. Again, the CML website, which I'll click over to in a second, where our position papers, our box score, and list of bills followed. Social media, Twitter and Facebook are our primary ones. And then I've got in red the annual Colorado laws enacted affecting municipalities. That is the compendium of exactly what it says, Colorado laws enacted affecting municipalities, that we put together, that describes all the bills that passed that have a municipal impact, and we do some reprints of those that are more significant, so that you can do a review of that. We do that online only. We've got the past few years online, and expect that to be done in early to mid-June. We always strive to get it done ahead of the conference. We just have to wait until the governor acts on all of them before we can officially publish it. And then, of course, our newsletter and our magazine. So thank you, and I'm going to open up the window here so that we can see if there's any questions, see what's on your mind. Give me just 1 second. One question, will there be discussion regarding the ACLU IA file public disclosure legislation, HB 191119? Megan?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. So Elizabeth is referring to House Bill 1119. This has to do with public access to internal affairs records when there is an interaction with the public. CML, the police chiefs, and other entities worked with the ACLU at the beginning of the session. It was the ACLU, the Press Association, and the Broadcasters Association who were bringing the bill to put some guardrails on that piece of legislation. There are a lot of significant changes that we made when it was in the when it was in the House. One of the biggest ones being that it applies to only internal affairs investigations that are taking place after the passage of this bill. So it is not retroactive. There's also some options for redactions and some other things that will help us to at least implement the bill. The Fraternal Order of Police remained opposed even once CMO and the police chiefs removed our opposition, as did the county sheriffs. That bill has passed the legislature, both houses, and is headed to the governor right now.
Okay. Don't have any other questions in the queue, but please do if you have any questions, something we didn't cover. Now is the time to ask them. Just our sense of what's going to happen the remainder of this legislative session. That's a really good question. We've been talking about the fact that there are big issues that are before the General Assembly in various stages along the way right now, and almost too many for the amount of time that's left and the amount of oxygen that they are all consuming and competing. But while that's going on, we know there are still some pieces of legislation that either have to get in or are going to be priority items, like sports betting, for example, and things that are still out there that we know folks are fully intending to bring. So I think the rest of this session is going to be, everyone just ought to buckle up, because there's going to be a lot of bills competing with each other, a lot of majority priority bills that are going to be competing with each other, and it remains to be seen how much bandwidth there will be left in the session. Last call for any questions or comments. I guess you can type comments, suggestions, compliments, we'll take those. And if you don't have anything, we'll wait a minute, see if anything pops in there, and so we'll stand by for just a second. Okay, well, I think that will do it for today then. I want to thank everyone for participating. If there's a question you want to ask, and ask us directly or individually, feel free to call us or shoot us an email. We're always here, or at least we'll be here when we're done at the Capitol and get back to you at any time. Thanks so much for joining, and we'll hopefully see you at the annual conference.